My name is Professor KwaZulu-Natal Govender, and it's an immense privilege and honor for me to reflect on the journey that Professor David McQuoid-Mason has traveled over 50 years as an academic, both in South Africa and on his contributions internationally. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Yes, I was a student at the University of Natal, and Professor McQuoid-Mason was the dean. Now, this was in 1984, a long time ago, and our association started with him being in a position of authority over me as a dean of the law school and my being a student. Subsequently, they offered me a job at the university. I went through an interview process. We became colleagues. And we've been friends ever since. We now work on some initiatives together. I'm the chair of an organization called Ally Trust, which essentially raises funds to help law clinics in various parts of the country to provide access to justice to indigent persons. And Professor McQuoid-Mason and I work on that trust together, and we work on other projects as well. Yes, it's an amazing story. A professor at George Washington University in the United States, a man called Professor Ed O'Brien, came up with this concept of educating people about the law. So this was not educating law students, but educating people in prisons, educating school children, educating educators, teachers, etc., about core principles of law. His thinking was that if they understand aspects, for example, of consumer protection, it will improve their quality of life. So it was very successful in the United States, and he called it street law because it was law meant for the streets. And then he was looking for a partner in South Africa. Remember, this was at the height of apartheid at the time. And many universities said to him, listen, this government's never going to allow this. And he then stumbled upon David McQuoid-Mason, who was dean then at our law school. And David just enthusiastically embraced the idea. And so street law was brought to South Africa. It has been a phenomenal success. They've had programs with children. I worked on some manuals with Prof. McQuoid-Mason to explain different concepts of law. They've taken that into the schools. And street law was a phenomenal success here simply because it made law more accessible. In the early days, remember this was still during apartheid, what Professor McQuoid-Mason did was that he came up with the idea of space colonies. So we'd get students from the various schools to come together. Remember, these students had never had associated with each other except in their own racial groups. So he had exclusively African schools, Indian schools, colored and white schools. He'd bring them together, and he used to do it at Utongati in Tongaat. And he'd get them to think about how a new constitution of the country would look like. But not to upset the apartheid authorities, we make it a space colony. So we'll assume that they're somewhere out of space, but they're faced with the same problems that we're faced with in South Africa. And then what we'd do at the end of the day was we'd have a trial, and then the students would have, in front of their parents, etc., have a full-blown trial. They lead their witnesses, argue their cases, etc. And Pius Langa judged some of this, Vuga Shabalala, he asked me to do it, various other people did it. And so the students enjoy that experience, and the idea was to communicate to them that law could be something you learn and enjoy.
I was one of the guinea pig students when street law at UKZN was started. And in those years, it was the tail end of apartheid. We knew that change was coming. We knew that change was in the air. And David prepared us for that by programs designed to educate the masses about the law and to prepare students and our communities for elections. And I remember going through years and years thereafter, carrying forward my street law lessons into my profession, into my practice.
David was a new lecturer when he taught me in 1974 and 1975. He was approachable and different because even in those days his clothing style was edgy. But rather than just lecture, he encouraged class discussion, which wasn't at all common in those days. A few years later, we studied together at University College London, and because I was studying shipping law, he persuaded me to start an elective course in shipping law once we were back in Durban. I did this part-time and later joined the staff full-time. It was in this context that I saw David's fresh vision for applied legal studies. The idea of clinical education was revolutionary. Later, street law was introduced, and that too was a real innovation in South Africa. These, I think, were probably the first institutional programs in a law faculty in South Africa that attempted to deal with apartheid inequalities.
Professor McQuoid-Mason has made his mark in many areas of the law and received many awards and accolades. In the context of the work of the NPA, I will mention just one. The establishment in the early 70s of the first legal aid clinic on the Howard College campus of UKZN, run by law students. Professor McQuoid-Mason was a trailblazer in this regard, and he pioneered legal aid for those in need in South Africa and well beyond. The right to legal representation is a basic tenet of a fair trial in criminal courts and a critical component of justice.
Yes, I mean, it's really sometimes a challenge to reflect on how bad things were then. There's a picture on my wall which I think you're going to focus on it later. But in 1989, I was just appointed as a lecturer to the law school, and there were protests on all our campuses against apartheid. I mean, the students were very active in the struggle against apartheid. One of the bravest things I remember, standing on the bank of Howard College. Our law school is an elevated part of the university, and 4 students, they all happened to be white students, were seated, and I think there were 3 white students and 1 African student, they were seated across the road, and a Casper, which is the army vehicle, was racing at high speed towards them, and these students just sat there as an act of defiance, and we were just watching from the top as the Casper screeched to a stop a few inches from the students. And so what Professor McQuoid-Mason did was he formed what we called a legal reactionary unit. So there was a police reactionary unit which reacted to this, all demonstrations, etc. And so we provided support for the students. Whenever the students were arrested, we'd go and try and bail them out. We'd take their names, numbers while they were sitting in the vans, make sure that their parents were notified. And I recall, and in a number of instances, we'd go to court, make representations, etc. On one occasion, there was a meeting at the Students' Union, and it was packed to capacity. I can't remember who the keynote speaker was, but the security police came in there, and this is the strategy they used on many occasions. They came in there and they were filming the event. Now, obviously, they were doing it for the purposes of intimidating people. So they had these 2 cameras, and they were filming the audience and filming the speakers. Professor McQuoid-Mason went on stage, And he said to the crowd, ladies and gentlemen, please look at those two security police officers there. I want you all to applaud them. I'll tell you why I want you to applaud them. You see, they are recording what we are doing for the sake of history. Future generations are going to come and they're going to have a record of these proceedings. So we must be thankful to them for what they're doing. So please applaud them. So all the students, and they started clapping. And these two guys look at each other. They fold all the cameras and then they left. And so, in a sense, those were the sort of experiences, but it's been more than that. There were the protests on the beaches. The beaches were segregated at the time. Can you believe that? The white beach was near Addington, all that area. Then you had a beach for colored people, and then you had a beach for Indian people, and a beach for African people. And Professor McQuoid-Mason and other people were involved in the desegregation of the beach when they just walked as a group, as a multiracial group, just across all the beaches as a protest action. So there are various steps that he took, but just as an academic, I think it's important. At that time, the government were segregating the universities as well. So what Prof. McQuoid-Mason did, in order to ensure that students of color were able to come to University of Natal, he created a special course called Race and the Law, which was not offered at UDW, it was not offered at Zululand. So the students would say, I want to do that course. And because that's not offered there, I want to be able to go to Natal. And a number of students were able to register when they ought to have gone to a segregated university. And so those were some of the innovations that he used to get around the stifling confines of the system.
David, as Dean, was a facilitator. If you had an idea, you were told to run with it. Admittedly, in those days, there were very few bureaucratic forms to complete. So if you had an idea for a new elective course, it was often on offer in the next semester. David encouraged us to follow our passions.
David has had a remarkable impact on my career in the law, partly because of those early formative influences at the law school, where he taught us about demystifying the law, breaking down esoteric concepts into simple concepts that made a difference to the lives of ordinary people. And that formulated my view of the law, if you like, a system of living law that grows within the community. And so when I started practicing law professionally as an advocate, my goal was in many respects to do what David had taught me to do, which was to break down these concepts into simple terms so that the people, the members of the community that I was representing, could understand, and the arbitrator or the judge, whoever it was, could also understand the wider social impact of what it is that we were doing. So simple credit agreements, simple default judgments on mortgage bonds, all have a much wider social dimension, particularly in this country where there is so much inequality and difference in access to resources.
David McQuoid-Mason, I do want to congratulate you on your 50 years in the Legal Academy. You probably have no idea of the impact and the influence you've had on students like me, who, when we first came to the University of Natal, were completely and utterly ignorant about the ways of the academy, the ways of the legal profession, and a range of issues related to law. You have been such an inspiration to me. You, right at the outset, gave me the opportunity to observe law in a very real way, in the way that law in apartheid South Africa in 1977 could only be observed, namely by giving me this position at the legal aid clinic that set me on a path of my own career, in which I have gone on to become a law professor in the United States, as well as serving as the president and dean in New York at Albany Law School and at the University of Cape Town. You've given me extraordinary inspiration. You've guided me to resources, and I don't know how I could thank you, even begin to thank you for all that you've done.
Yeah, I'll talk about South Africa. In my class, we had Justice McQuoid-Mason's, who I don't know very well, but he went on to be Chief Justice. But we also had Justice Sandile Ngcobo, who I know well, and Justice Raymond Zondo. All of them were in my class. And I think all of them will say that in some way or the other they were influenced by the law school in general and Professor McQuoid-Mason in particular. And other people who were playing prominent roles. Shamila Batoy was a student of ours.
Professor McQuoid-Mason is an inspiration. As we in the National Prosecuting Authority, the lawyers for the people, dedicate ourselves to rebuilding public confidence in the National Prosecuting Authority, to restoring faith in the rule of law, and to ensuring that justice wins. As the father of our nation, President Nelson Mandela, once said, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others, and that will determine the significance of the life we lead." I thank you, Professor.
Yes, I think he's been active in many parts of the world. I've been with him in India, and where he's very highly regarded in India. And again, it's a society similar to ours, where you have laws that are laws that really try and bring about social change. And then there's the challenge about how you make sure that those laws are respected. And so street law found a very fertile ground in India. People liked it, they engaged with it, but he's done it in Nepal, he's various other African countries, we've done it in Malawi, Zambia, and various other parts of the world. So it's an idea that you can export, but obviously whenever he goes to another country, he's got to use that particular country's laws and see how you implement it. So often what he does is he uses lawyers. So I know, for example, he did a lot of work in Bangladesh as well. I think he's been to something like 128 countries in the world doing these sorts of programs, together with legal aid as well. So that's another leg of his contribution. Yes, I think it's an important question for two reasons. Very often, people are social activists, or they're very serious academics. So they sit in their office and they write the books, and they're most comfortable doing that. Or they do the social activism, they engage with the community. David is one of the few people that straddles both those stools. There's the social activism part, but then he's a serious academic. He's a A-rated researcher with the NRF. I think he's published something close to 200 articles in various journals. And as I said, that when he was dean of our law school, there was a very heavy emphasis on the excellence of the product that we were offering. And I think you need someone, because the students are very young at the time. They want, and many of them want to get the degree. And what we had to communicate to them is that you will not thank us in future years if we give you a degree that does not really matter. And if we're going to pretend this degree is worth something, you pretend that you've achieved something of substance. In practice, the pretense will stop. And it's for that reason, I think, that we wanted an environment where the law school would be an area for critical thought, but an area of academic excellence. And I think it's the combination of that resulted in this, I would say, a serious contribution that Professor McQuoid-Mason has made to academia and to the broader South African community.
And I think for me, the lasting impact that David has made is that I approach the law very much as an organism within the society that we live in. And that is certainly something that I credit David McQuoid-Mason with.
I know that I'm sharing a video with many, many people from inside South Africa and around the world who are honoring you and who are thanking you for your service. The three qualities that I so admire about you is first, obviously, your smarts, your brilliance. You foresaw access to justice in a fundamental way before 1994. And you set in place not just the people who are going to do the actual provision of access to justice, but the institutions that were going to make them possible. So you were way ahead of your time. So it's your brilliance and your foresight. The second is your kindness. You have always been such a kind individual, and kindness is in such short shrift in our world today. You exemplify that. And the third is your compassion. You have gone to all corners of South Africa and the globe to share your resources, your skills, to enable and empower others to be able to continue the work of access to justice, which is the motive of your life. So I want to say thank you, congratulations, you're wonderful, and I love you. Big hug.
Yes, he certainly has those qualities that you've emphasized. There's a wonderful picture of him, the Queen greeting him, with Professor McQuoid-Mason dressed in his colorful gown. But it's interesting that she went to him because she was attracted by his jacket. And so first point is, despite his dress sense, he's actually quite conservative on a number of issues. As I said, about academic excellence, about various other issues. But the dress sense, I think, attracts people to him. He's a very open person. People see the dress sense as someone who's very friendly. And what he's done, he's sort of incorporated the African flair and preference for color and exuberance into his dress sense, and people respond to that very positively. So I think the dress sense has always been there, so it's not a contrived thing. A lot of people decided to dress like that after Mandela adopted it, but David was doing it much earlier. And I remember how President Mandela reacted to him in a similar sort of fashion. I recall before President Mandela became president, it was a couple of months before, he was invited to our law school. And then there's a picture of us on my wall. And he walked into the dining room, and we were all nervous, and he had all the cakes and everything laid out there. And he spoke to David and spoke to the rest of us. He was very affirming. And then he picked up this plate of a pecan nut pie. This is the person that's going to be our next president. And he walked to everyone and he offered them this pecan nut pie. And everyone was so nervous that some people were taking it, other people weren't taking it. And then he said, the only reason why I walked around and offered every one of you this pecan nut pie was because I was going to make sure that I have one piece left for me. And I remember that, and there's a lovely picture of him and David walking down. You may have seen that, Tani. And they sort of had a lovely relationship. But I think they were also two people that were quite open and honest, and people sense that. You know, they sense that this person is a good person, and you see that with the president. I mean, Surya, my wife, danced for him, and I was at a function, and he wanted to greet all the dancers and thank them, and you just see the connection that other politicians will be fidgeting with their cell phones or doing other things, etc. But he was really focused on the people in front of him, and David has that similar sort of characteristic. So I think that personality is an important point. People just like David. I mean, you see that all over the world. People come up to him and they talk to him. They ask him for advice. They ask him how they should shape their careers. And it's important. And I say to colleagues in our law school now, all of us that have benefited from that, and I've benefited greatly from that, being a student of his and a colleague and our friend, that we must do this for the next generation of students as well. We must make ourselves available. So I try to make myself available for an hour or so. Any student that has questions to ask me, they can do that. But I think we need to do it more formally, because these are young people, they're looking for guidance. Some of them come from families where their parents have not gone to university. They're the first generation to go to university. And so I think the lesson that David has taught us is that to the extent that we have benefited, we must appreciate that, acknowledge it, but understand we have to reinvest it into our institutions again.